How's it going, PD team? Feeling a little under the weather, so my recording times haven't been consistent. Hopefully I'll be back on track very soon once I feel better. I wanted to get this one out of the way though. It's a quick tutorial. What are we going to be doing? We're going to be making a Gaussian blur texture node. So you can blur 3D noises, 2D flat images, pretty much anything procedurally. So here's before, and then we have a gradient slider that allows us to apply how much influence that is. Now I did 3 options for you to kind of pick apart. We've got this one. Then you can see here we've got a gradient where we can apply the gradient to it and we get a beautiful ramp where all the way to the left is the most influence and then the far right here is the least affected, and it renders out buttery smooth. Then the last one that's actually very awesome, and that is an animated noise where we can animate this. So you can see I can just flick the frames. So this could be water droplets. You could do UI design with this. There's so many uses for this, and it's procedural. So you don't have to do masks in Photoshop or After Effects. You can do this within Cinema 4D just with default Redshift nodes. So let's dive in. Okay, so here we are with Redshift. We've got Redshift loaded up. I've got a standard Redshift material. I'm going to apply it to my object here, and I'm going to start off with designing something to blur. I'm going to use the tiles, and I'm going to plug it in, turn on my IPR, and for this example, I'm going to just turn off the reflection to keep things fast, and I'm going to give these a color. There we go. So we're randomizing. I like taking this and setting this to 0.01 so we get some hard edges here. Let's zoom in so we can see the blur happening. Now this could be an image. It could be a 2D procedural texture like we have here. These tile nodes are procedural, but they are 2D. When you add a noise like the Maxon noise, this is a 3D texture. And with the right setup, you'll be able to basically blur in 3D with this node. So what we do is, I don't know how long they've had this node in here, but if you search for distorter, there's a distortion plugin. And I actually recently discovered this about a half a year ago. So it might be just that old. I have no idea. I haven't looked into it, but I know it's relatively new. And what you do is you can see you got 2 inputs, distorter and texture. Texture is going to be the texture that gets blurred, and distorter is the distortion map. So what we can do is we can add our noise into the distortion like so. And then we plug this in. And when you do that, you can see we have some wiggly distortions, which this is pretty cool. This is useful for stuff. But if we take our noise and bring it down to 0.1 or even less, we now get a blurring effect because the noise is so small, it appears as like a Gaussian. Now in the distortion, the default is set to directional. We want to be able to use this node that we're going to make in 3D textures, 2D textures, and image-based textures. So what we can do is we can change this to flow field, and I'll leave this on cycle, but now we have a Gaussian blur. And now we have a slider here for the amount that allows us to change how much influence this has. And I can't imagine you wanting to blur more than this anyway. So adjusting these values, leaving them the same, and then just making a slider for the amount. So we'll take all of these nodes, select them, and say group nodes, procedural blur. Now what we want to do is we want a slider that allows us to basically access those controls. So what we'll do is we'll go into the folder, and I'll come in here and I'll command or control click on the dot, not the keyframe, but the dot, to expose this parameter. So I'll click and just let go and say add new input, and I'll call this blur amount. So I'm going to double click blur amount. So now you can see we have a slider that allows us to affect. We also want to expose this tile texture to the root. So instead of linking this in here, I'm going to click and say add new input, and I'll just leave it called texture. Command X, go up a level by clicking up here, paste the tile into here, load up the texture, and now we have the same thing. But now what's cool is when we select this, you have a slider for the amount. Now, I don't want to go in the negative values. It's too confusing for this. So what I'll do is I'll go inside on the blur amount. I'm going to right click and say edit port. And now we can change the minimum to 0 and also the minimum here to 0. And we'll set this maximum to 1 so we don't have big values. And you can see we've got the step size set perfectly. And then you close it, and now you can see we go down to 0, and there's your effector. So I can bring it to a reasonable amount like 0.5. And now that's essentially it. And you can get really close to this and you don't see the noise. I don't know if it has to do with the resolution and it's blurring itself a little bit. I thought you would get, bumps and stuff, because if we go in here and I solo it, you have to go pretty close in. I also have denoising turned on, so let me get rid of that. So my noise is pretty small. I come in here, you can see I have it set to 0.1, and then you're gonna have to refresh, and you can see I can get in pretty close. Now, if you're gonna be really close to it, you can see we get some grain here happening. You just go into your noise here and just bring that to 0.05, and now you get a finer grain, and there's your blur. So that's it for this one. Let's do a gradient option. Is we'll double click and we'll add a ramp, and we'll also add a layer. We don't need this. We don't need this. We don't need mask. And we'll add our gradient here. I like setting my gradients to linear. Turn off the preview. And what we're going to do is instead of adding this noise right here, we're going to first, let's give ourselves some space here. We don't need this. So what we do is we load up in our base the noise, and then we'll add it into the distorter. And now it becomes clear, unblurred, because our base is black. Is if we load up a color ramp in here. So I'm going to load it up into layer 1 to clean things up here. So if I apply and say screen, there's our gradient, and I can change the direction. So you can see vertical. I could change it to horizontal, and let's increase the blur amount so it's very obvious. So there's your gradient. This might be useful. This one I see is kind of a very rare instance. I just wanted to show you that it can be done. So there's that. Now for the last one, let's do a animated noise effect. So I'm going to get rid of the ramp, turn this off for now. I'm going to add a noise again, solo it, and let's change this to something like 500. Turn up the contrast so we get something like this. This could be raindrops. This could be condensation on a can, and it'll work because we have it set on the distorter, set to flow field. This is a 3D texturizer. These are 2D. This one actually adheres to 3D noises when you do flow field. Okay, so I'm going to just add this in here and enable it and set it to screen, and we'll hit refresh, turn off our solo. There we go. Okay, so I had a little issue here with the refresh not updating the texture. So it was showing in black. There it goes. It might take a second to update. And then we can come in here to the max on noise, set the speed to something like 2 so it goes quick, and there's your animated noise map that's blurring out everything below it. Really cool. Now you do get this weird, interesting effect that kind of gives it a bevel effect, which is kind of cool. If you don't want that, you can bring the contrast down to like 0.9 or even just a little bit sharper, and you can see if you go to like 0.9695, the gradient is not as intense, so it doesn't create that bevel effect. Your transition is not as bad. So if you don't want that beveling effect, that fake bevel, just bring it down on the contrast. But there you go. There's an animated noise map for your blurring, all procedural. So let's make this thing reusable. So what you can do is you can expose these parameters like I did on this one here. So if I select this node, you can see we've got the gradient and all that stuff. I'm going to just expose this one. So I'm going to select it, go to here, make it a bright color. I like making them 220. And now we can just load up anything. So if I want to make this reusable, you just go to asset and you say convert to asset. Make sure you name it. So I'll say convert to asset, and we got procedural blur 1.0. I'm going to save this under preferences inside of Eric's textures, or you can make your own Eric's tools. How about that one? And there we go. Now it's saved. Now what I can do is I can use this again, but you notice now I go in here, there's no folder. So if I want to edit this and redo another version, so you can see this one has the noise on it, and I don't actually want to keep this. So to get inside of it, you go to asset and you say edit asset, or you go to here and say convert edit asset as group, and that just converts it. So I'm going to just delete this here. So I'm going to reset it back and go back to distorter and delete these two. So I just have a gradient, a standard slider. So there you go. So I can add this to any texture and blur it out. And this doesn't have to be in the color channel. You could blur out bump maps, reflection maps. They're independently blurred. Super powerful. I hope you found this useful. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss out on more content. Thanks for your support.